Muhammad, I'm a prophet because I said so. I have this hairy mole right on my shoulder, you know. And my bestest buddy Allah, he works for me though. I call him God to make you think I'm pure as white snow. In the damp cave of Hira, I met this bad man. He squeezed me until I threw up the Quran. When I ran to Khadija in anguish and fears, she explained, "This is Jibril," and wiped off my tears. I'm Muhammad, I'm a prophet because I am him, and Allah caters to my needs and every whim. His reward is that I let people think he is Lord. Then he lets me torment the people when I get bored. Now the world must revert and become just like me, and never ask questions and never be free. You'll become dumb blind Muslims and do as you're told, or your heads will be rolling your family's soul. Oh, Aisha, ooh la la, what a pretty dress. May I wear it? Your dresses get those revelations rolling. No, don't touch my eye makeup. Mine is too young for makeup. I'm 54 after all. My religion, Islam, grew like fungi on bread, due to people's reluctance to part with their head. And because I got rid of the people who think Allah's slaves can be duped to do things that sure stink. I'm Muhammad, I'm a prophet because I said it. I meet up with Jibreel when I'm in need of you. And my bestest buddy Allah delivers on time. These girls and boys and slaves and all these riches of mine. I'm Muhammad, I'm a prophet because I told you. My brothel in the sky awaits if you say it's true. But if Allah will find out in the mosque you did fart, He'll dump you in the hellfire when you depart. He'll dump you in the hellfire when you depart. Oh, Aisha, I still feel the pain after the food I ate in Khaybar. Allah is cutting my aorta.
Hello and welcome everybody to the stream today. We apologize for being a bit late. We are actually still waiting on our guest to join us, Robert Spencer, on the topic, Did Muhammad exist? So for right now, until he comes, if he comes, we'll get the interview started and we'll have the topic be the stream be about that topic. But for now, we have myself and Daughter of Christ, and we'll just kind of fill in some time until if Robert Spencer comes. If not, then we can maybe just do an open kind of Q&A, or you guys want to interact with us, ask questions, anything like that. We'll try to answer your questions to the best of our ability. So welcome, Daughter of Christ. Thanks for joining today.
Thank you for having me, brother. Hello, everyone. Nice to be with you again. I'm kind of recovering from the party we had last night. It was a lit party.
Yeah.
We had so many hadiths. We went over the holes in the narrative and the Quran holes, and we went over just a sample of the evidence from Islamic tradition about how there are so many holes.
Yes.
That was fun, brother, wasn't it?
That was really fun, and we really enjoy seeing your comments as well. You guys make some really funny comments. The comment section is hilarious. And then, of course, your comments on the live stream as well. We always like to try to read and keep up with you all. So yeah, that was really fun stream. And every year, you also recall these holes in the narrative, holes in the narrative streams. And other people put out videos as well on the topic. Thought that was really funny. So yeah.
So we say hello to people in the chat. God bless you guys. J. Diaz, Hello, God bless you. XYZ, happy anniversary +1. Happy
Mm.
anniversary to you too. Never thought I'd say that to people I don't know, but
Yeah.
yeah, that's the power of Yasser Qadi.
Michael.
Michael, God bless you. Church in Morocco, hello, brother. Thank you for being with us again. Always good to have you, brother, and have your comments.
Top Gun.
You want to say hi to some more?
Yeah,
No
we're just kind of scrolling through your comments here, trying to put you all on the screen. So yeah, as I said, the topic today, the stream title is "Did Muhammad Exist?" We are, Lord willing, going to be doing this with Robert Spencer if he's going to be with us today. If not, it'll be rescheduled, Lord willing, for another time. So yeah, Church in Morocco, yes, thank you, welcome.
So we thought we'd open it up to you, since you are our guests now until our guests come.
Yes.
To any Q&As or any comments that you guys want to make.
Yeah, give us any of your DCCI ministry related questions, comments, and we'll try to the best of our abilities to answer you all. Is this going to be a series? It's possible. It's possible. I know that Robert Spencer has written on the topic, and I believe he actually updated his book on it. So he's always adding in new information, new evidences for his position. So it's very possible. It's going to be it could turn into a series. I'm also, I should say, also I'm filling in for our sister Atun on this as well. So maybe when she returns, she'll do more with Robert Spencer as well in this.
I'm convinced that there was a homicidal pedophile false prophet in 7th century Arabia.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm with you, brother.
So yeah, we just gonna kind of really be just feeding off of your comments and feedback, and kind of that's how this is gonna go until Robert comes. If not, we'll kind of just end out the stream earlier than normal, and then we'll be back to our regular scheduling whenever we start scheduling streams for next week. So yeah. So yeah, the topic of Muhammad existing, it's obviously a topic that even Christians are divided on. David Wood has debated Robert Spencer on the topic. He's debated Jay Smith on the topic. And so it's interesting to hear people's perspectives on this. And why or why not, why do they believe Muhammad existed? Why do they reject his existence? So we got a question here. Okay.
Do you know any Muslim catch the night of power? I was a Muslim for a long time. I never caught that night. That night is a fictional night.
Yeah, that's the mythical.
Yeah, you know what? It's funny because even if you catch it, how do you know you catch it? Brother Church in Morocco, I think you may be ex-Muslim. So tell me, did you ever catch it? And if you did, how did you know?
No, he said me either.
Yeah, me either.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
So it's just a fictional thing, and plus Muhammad didn't make it very easy because he said it's in the last 10 days, so it could be any of those days, and then he said
any of the last 10,
the odd numbers. So you kind of, I used to just cover them all just to be sure.
Yeah.
But then you put your heart, you really put your heart in the 27th because you kind of know it really is the 27th, even though it's not obvious that it's the 27th. But anyway. Brother Phil, when is the night of Qadr? Yes, thank you, brother.
Okay, we have
I don't believe in an existence of an Arabian prophet named Muhammad, yet I am a Muslim. That's interesting. Is that?
I don't know how that makes sense.
That's a contradiction in terms, my friend.
Yeah.
Oh, he may be one of those people who believe
maybe Muhammad wasn't Arabian.
But look at the logo. It's a cross and a crescent.
So okay.
You're trying to mix Jesus with something else. It doesn't really work, my friend.
Idris
al-Kalima.
Okay, interesting. So yeah, welcome everybody. We see some people coming in. And yeah, again, this is meant to be a live stream with Robert Spencer on the topic, did Muhammad exist? So right now we are just kind of waiting on him if he's going to be coming. If not, we'll Lord willing, reschedule with him. And until then, we'll just kind of talk with you all. We have a question and answers or anything you guys want to say, comments. We love to hear your feedback.
Is it true they claim they come from the Hagar side of Abraham?
That's what they claim. Now, whether or not it's true, it's another story. You do have some people who will argue that not Muslims, but specifically Arabs, are Arabs descendants of Ishmael, and you have people arguing for and against that. You have an interesting genealogy contradiction in Muhammad's lines, his lineage as well, where I think it's to Adnan or something. They have someone. There's someone that they say can only go back. You can only go back this far, and beyond that is just like a guessing game. So, are Arabs descendants of? Do they go back to Abraham? Do they go back to Ishmael? The Bible actually tells us not to get boggled down with these genealogies.
Right.
It's not really an important, where you come from. The most important thing is your spiritual status. But I have seen, people like secular academics argue both ways. They argue both ways. So you just have to kind of read that and check out the arguments and see where you think the evidence really lines up with. And that's what Robert Spencer would help us a lot with. He'd lay out his arguments and his evidences for Muhammad's existence, and then you kind of make your decision in terms of where you think the evidence weighs and leads to. Okay. What do Muslims think about Gnostic stories in the Quran? Okay, so if you're a Muslim and someone says, "Hey, this story comes from a Gnostic gospel," what's the Muslim response to that? What do they say?
Muslims wouldn't have heard of anything called Gnostic gospels or Gnostic stories. They don't know that term. You really think highly of Muslim knowledge if you think that. I never heard that term until I came to Jesus and I started reading, and then I realized, those stories in the Quran, they don't come from the Bible. They don't come, they come from, they're Gnostic stories. They're stories that came from other sources, not the Bible, the inspired word of God. So I would say, wise son, Muslims don't know. They don't know, first of all, they don't know what there's such a thing as Gnostic stories, and they don't know where they came from. If they knew, they wouldn't be Muslim, right? So if you want to educate them, that would be a great thing to do. And one of those stories is the Seven Sleepers.
Yes, Seven Ephesus. Yeah.
Of Ephesus.
Yeah.
That is a story that the Quran tells us if it's true. And Allah is a miracle, but then He doesn't tell you how many they were. So the fact that I say 7 is because of the Gnostic story, not from the Quran, but it tells it, and you think, oh, this sounds very similar. And when Muhammad goes into the cave, and then the spider web and the pigeons outside, all that comes from a different story. I believe 4th century of Christians being persecuted, and he just borrowed the detail. So Muslims don't know is my answer.
Yeah. So the legends that have arisen over the years, even if they're things that are in different Christian traditions, there are stories that Muhammad just took as being true, and he just kind of compiled them like a mix mash of different things. So here's there's Christians who believe in the 7 Sleepers of Ephesus. There's Christians who believe in this. There's Jews who believe in this. There's pagans who believe in this. He's kind of mix mashes it all together into his book. Now, of course, we're assuming Muhammad's existence when we're saying all of that stuff, and Robert's topic is going to be whether or not that's accurate. So.
Yeah.
We'll see.
And Brother Phil, thank you. Guys, Brother Phil's posts all these links. They're very good for the full picture of information on what we're talking. So please use his links. They're very useful.
I want to confirm Legends of the Jews. I was being told about a number of different sources. A friend of mine who was going over Legend of the Jews, as you say here, and it's just like story after story after story. Oh, Muhammad got this from here, angels bowing down to Adam, or this story, or this story. All of it. It's amazing how much of this stuff you can trace. The question is, if Muhammad, came up with something original, what would that original thing be? in the Quran? Does the Quran actually present anything original? I think you can really trace it to something before.
The answer is no. Nothing original.
Yeah.
And that's what the people
I
said.
mean, even the nonsense stuff, maybe you could say, but in terms of information about God, or obviously there's nothing in God about God that we learn about in the Quran. He just says God is one. That's it. He doesn't give us any information about God other than lies and saying he makes things up about God. It's like God doesn't have a son. Jesus is not Allah. Things like that. So the lies that he tells us, but and just if you just ask the question, what information does Muhammad bring that people before him, like you have heretics before Muhammad who denied these things, like they denied that Jesus is God or something. People who are like denying the Christian faith. So what did Muhammad bring that's actually new?
Yeah, even his heresies.
Yeah, even the heresies are recycled. Did Uthman invent Muhammad? I don't know if that's the direction that people go in when they say that Muhammad didn't exist. I think that I mean, maybe that is. I haven't. Maybe that's a question we can ask for Robert Spencer if that's something that people go to. Did Uthman invent Muhammad? We know that according to some of the stories, that Uthman actually did have some. Well, I mean, he had a big influence, compiling the Quran and stuff like that, and he had one of the caliphs, so definitely has power to make things up. All right, so with that being said, we actually do have Robert Spencer with us, so we will continue on. Thank you all for your questions. So without further ado, let's bring him on. Hey, Robert, welcome to the show today.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
All right. So we were just kind of introducing to everybody the topic today. Did Muhammad exist? And we were laying out a little bit in terms of people's questions, why someone might believe Muhammad existed. Why do you think he wouldn't have existed? So so again, we want to welcome you to the stream, and we'll just get you started right away. So thanks again for joining us, and why don't you tell us a little bit about what got you interested in this topic, and what kind of made you dig it, write your book about it and things like that. What do you say?
Yeah, I wrote a biography of Muhammad way back in 2006 called The Truth About Muhammad, still available, and it's just basically a summary of the standard Islamic accounts of Muhammad's life. I wrote it so that people non-Muslims would know what the Islamic sources really say about what Muhammad said and did. And so it's based on Ibn Hisham, which of course is based on Ibn Ishaq. It's also dependent upon Ibn Sa'd, Bukhari, and Muslim in their biographical material, and so on. And anyway, as I was writing that, I saw that this material actually was also late. It comes from 200 years after Muhammad lived, or is supposed to have lived. And you go back earlier, you really don't find very much. And so in a couple years after that, in 2008, I believe it was, I was in the Netherlands, I believe, in The Hague, speaking at a conference, and got there a little bit early and took a walk. It was the middle of the day, and I'd never been to the city, so went out and took a walk around the city, and I ran into Ibn Warraq. I mean, what are the chances? He was also speaking at this conference, and he was looking for a museum. There was a painting in a museum, the Rijksmuseum in The Hague, if I recall correctly, that had this very famous painting. I don't remember which one that he wanted to see, and so I tagged along, and we were chatting about the work we do, and so it ended up being a lot about Muhammad, and I was kind of surprised because questions had arisen for me when I wrote The Truth About Muhammad. But yeah, Rijksmuseum, thank you. And I hadn't really followed up. I was surprised when we got onto that topic that he was definite. This is a fable. This is not a historical account. And so I decided to follow up on that, wrote The Truth About Did Muhammad Exist in 2011. And then so much material has been produced in this field, in this connection, since then, that I revised Did Muhammad Exist in 2021. And so the revised and expanded edition of Did Muhammad Exist is out there. And I'm still investigating this issue. Actually, I'm writing a new biography of Muhammad that's called Muhammad, A Critical Biography, and that will be out next year. I'm not even going to turn it in till December 1st. But it's examining the stories of Muhammad from a historical critical standpoint. And I think people are going to be surprised. I can give you a kind of a preview of some of it as we go along. But a lot of the things that people think are just told straightforwardly in the Islamic traditions about what Muhammad did, actually, the Islamic traditions don't agree at all. And there are all these different versions in which he does or says different things, or small details are off, which only makes it clearer that none of this is real. Also, before I go back to you, I did want to note that somebody is here saying in the comments that Robert Hoyland's Seeing Islam as Others Saw It is a great source for the earliest references to early Islam and Muhammad. And while that's true to a certain extent, people who are investigating whether Muhammad existed or if he did exist, how much of what we know about him from Islamic tradition is historical, people should be aware that Robert Hoyland plays with the evidence. It's kind of interesting because, you know, the scholars, the academics at the colleges, the Saudi-funded and Qatari-funded universities sneer at the work of people like Ibn Warraq and me, and they claim to be objective scholars, but actually they're the ones playing with the evidence, not us. Robert Hoyland takes very early documents that refer to the Tayyeh or the Saracens or the Hagarians or Muhajirun or various other terms, and he translates them as Muslims, when that's just the issue. If you want to use Hoyland's book to find out when people started talking about Muslims as such and about Muhammad and about Islam, you can't tell, because he fixes the translations so that it looks as if people are talking about Muslims and Islam far earlier than they actually are.
Okay, definitely looking out for your critical biography of Muhammad. I did see you tweeting about that, and yeah, thanks for your comments on that as well, Robert Hollins. I was going to ask you as well about I think his name is Stephen Shoemaker, A Prophet Has Appeared. What's your take on that book? I didn't finish it. I was just kind of looking through it one day, and I was curious what you'd kind of make of a book like that.
Well, here again, you have a book that's produced out of the academic establishment, and so it has some value, but it's only going to go so far. Even Patricia Crona, who is the pioneer of the revisionist understanding of Islamic history, retreated from her position later on in life. And, you know, Jay Smith, who was her student, talks about this, that she was constrained to a tremendous degree in academia. And so it has to be understood, Shoemaker's working from within the academic establishment, and they're just not going to go as far as they could or should when it comes to dealing with the actual evidence. And they will retreat into conformism for the sake of keeping jobs rather than speak the truth. Like, what's that guy's name? Marijn van Putten.
I was just thinking about him as well. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Good example.
He does some good work about the text of the Quran, but he's such an establishmentarian, and he's such a coward that he draws back from making any of the obvious conclusions that his own work leads to. And even when it comes to controversial issues, he just won't get into it. He's got a job he's got to protect, and his academic reputation that he's got to protect. So, for example, I was writing about the critical Quran that I published last year, and in chapter 33, verse 56 of the Quran, I translate Allah prays for the prophet because that's what the passage says. And he actually tweeted, without, I think, realizing, that he was going to get in trouble. He tweeted that I was right about this because people were going to him and saying, look at this liar Spencer and how terrible he is. Look what he said about the Quran and Allah praying for the prophet. And he said, well, actually, he's right. That's what the text does say. But then he deleted the tweet later on because he was afraid that he might look bad if he ends up publicly agreeing with me, And so, these guys are not interested in the truth. They're not interested in finding out what really happened. They're interested in staying within their crowd and reinforcing various assumptions that those who are signing the checks want them to reinforce. But this is not about finding out what really happened. You want to find out what really happened, then you do have to read Did Muhammad Exist?, the critical Quran, and coming up, Muhammad, the critical biography.
All right, excellent. And I do remember reading those tweets from Marion Van Putten, and he made it really clear that he thought that was a real linguistic problem. And then once he realized, as you said, that it's the words are coming from you, immediately distances himself from what he wrote, deletes it, and apparently he blocked you as well or something. Yeah, it's just really cowardly.
I have no respect for somebody like that. I mean, that's just totally cowardly. I would debate him on any of these issues anytime he wanted. I'll freely acknowledge that he has in one sector of this field, he has in the area where he's specializing, he knows far more about it, but he doesn't have the courage of his convictions. And this is a character flaw. It's not really an intellectual problem, but it leads to intellectual problems, because if he's not willing to follow the truth, if the truth is spoken by people who his masters have told him are not acceptable or not in the group, then he's not really interested in the truth. And that doesn't just go for him, of course, it goes for everyone.
Yeah, it's just a good way to kind of showcase the academic, quote unquote, mindset and how they operate. I remember someone asked them about the word like makr in chapter 3, verse 54, and they say, hey, Christians like Spencer say that this, says that Allah is the best of deceivers, and he says, well, makr does have that meaning, but then he goes on to kind of, disqualify it again and tell you, I don't want to be associated with, Spencer and stuff like that. So yeah.
Yeah.
Right, so
the problem is that when it comes down to it, the only reason why he doesn't want to be associated, and the only reason why I have this reputation, is because I speak truths that the jihadis would rather have concealed, the jihadis and their friends. And so he's just really kowtowing and bowing to some very dangerous elements.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So when we get to this topic of Muhammad existing, well, just about, I guess, anyone existing, what kind of things do we look for when we ask, did so and so exist, or what are the things that we kind of generally look for, and why, in your view, does Muhammad lack these things?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And you remind me, I've got to put some kind of comparison in the critical biography, because people don't really know what they're dealing with. So let's take an easy one to start with. What if we wanted to say Donald Trump didn't exist, that Donald Trump is this tremendous myth that was made up at the big end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st? And what we would look for to try to determine whether Donald Trump actually existed is, first, are there contemporary witnesses? And obviously there are. Do we have his own words? We do. Do we have the testimony of adversaries and friends? Yes. So it looks like Donald Trump existed. Obviously, when you go farther back, the records are more sketchy and it's harder to tell. So you look at Jesus, and many people want to compare Muhammad with Jesus because it's the founders of the two largest religions, or two of the largest religions anyway. And when you look at that, it's a very neat comparison, as a matter of fact, because the crucifixion of Christ took place around 33 AD, and the death of Muhammad took place around 632 AD. And so you can take the period of the 30s on, say for the 50 years from the 30s to the 80s of the 1st century and of the 7th century. And in the Christian context, in that period, you do not have very many people outside the group talking about Jesus. But on the other hand, that's not all that surprising, because he didn't live in a major center where there were a lot of people who'd be paying attention in any case. He was just another prophet among many claimed prophets among the Jews. But you do have Tacitus in the 50s and Flavius Josephus in the 70s talking about the Christians. You do have the general consensus of the modern day scholars that the New Testament writings were all written during the 1st century. You have the establishment of churches in various cities around the Roman Empire. And you also have the post-New Testament writings of Clement of Rome, and in the early 2nd century, Ignatius of Antioch, and so on. And those quote the Gospels and show a clear awareness that the Christian religion is up and running. Now, by contrast, you go from the 630s to the 680s or 690s, and you actually have a massive military expansion, which you don't have in Christianity at all. You have the conquest of the Middle East, of North Africa, of Persia, and part of India. And by 732, 100 years after Muhammad's supposed to have died, you have a huge empire stretching from Spain to India. But what's extraordinary is that while these conquests are going on, and we all were taught, I was taught back in college or wherever, that these things were done because of the Islamic religion, and the Islamic religion was what they were inspired by and what led them out to take it out elsewhere and so on. You don't find Muhammad, and you don't find the Quran. You find a couple of mentions. There's a mention in the 630s of an Arabian prophet, but he is invading Palestine after he's supposed to have died, according to Islamic tradition. And he's preaching things about the coming Jewish Messiah, which is not really a major part of Islam. And in other words, the details about this Arabian prophet don't match up with Muhammad. You have a couple of mentions of Muhammad after that in the 640s, 650s, and even then, they don't match the story. You have, according to Islamic tradition, you have Uthman collecting the Quran and distributing and codifying it and distributing it to the Islamic provinces by 653 or in 653, and yet you don't have anybody quoting it. You don't have anybody even mentioning it until the 690s. You have mosques, but the mosques don't seem to have been Islamic. And people have trouble with this concept. They think, wait a minute, what's a mosque if it's not Islamic? Well, it was apparently a kind of Abrahamic house of worship. But there are traditions, for example, Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, who was the governor of Iraq from 685 to 705, he is credited with a lot of the things that we take for granted as being part of Islam today. There is even an Islamic tradition in which an old man says, we never used to read the Mashaf, that is, we read the Quran in the mosques until the time of Hajjaj. Now, if they had it from the 650s, from 653, why didn't they start reading it in the mosques until 40 years later? Doesn't make any sense. But if you accept that tradition and say, yeah, they started reading it in the mosques in the 690s, it makes sense of everything. That they didn't have the Quran before the 690s. And that's why they started reading it then. And they didn't talk about Muhammad or the Quran before that because they weren't there. They didn't exist. That this was a kind of Abrahamic monotheistic sect that, once it amassed this massive empire, wanted to elaborate on its religion, because religion was the glue of empires in those days. And so they developed Islam as a means to unify and perpetuate their empire.
Okay, very interesting. So when it comes to a lot of these stories, that it's kind of funny because, you know, Muslims are the ones that are mostly telling us, like when you quote them a hadith or something, it's like, oh, that's fabricated, that's false. It's kind of ironic that they're the ones that are doing that. Yeah.
Well, you know what's wild about that is, I mean, even the standard Islamic story in the first place allows for a massive amount of forgery. We're told that Bukhari collected 600,000 hadiths, reports about Muhammad's words and deeds, and he kept 7,000. He rejected 593,000 as forgeries. And I think, yeah, he was right. He was just off by 7,000. All 600,000 were forgeries. And the thing about it is, nowadays, as you noted, Islamic apologists are starting to pick up on the revisionist account of Islam's origins. And I think this is the wildest thing that I've ever seen. That I see Islamic apologists nowadays. There's a non-Muslim Islamic apologist, like Karen Armstrong was a non-Muslim Islamic apologist, and his name is Joshua Little. And he wrote this lengthy dissertation that you can find online explaining that Aisha's hadith are fake, that she wasn't really 6 when Muhammad married her. She wasn't really 9 when he consummated the marriage. And so the Islamophobes have no case. Okay, well, I actually agree with Joshua when he's talking all about how the hadith are all fake. But that's the basis on which he's saying that the Aisha hadith are fake. He has an elaborate concocted theory for why the Aisha hadith are fake in a way that the others are not, but it really doesn't hold. His argument against the Aisha hadith is really based on exactly the same arguments that I used in Did Muhammad Exist to show that the whole thing was fake. And so he doesn't realize that he's sitting on the tree limb and sawing it off at the same time. But that's what he's doing. And then I see people invoking his work, Islamic apologists invoking his work to refute the idea that Aisha was a child when she was married to Muhammad. And I think these people have no idea that what they are doing is endorsing views that will lead to the total rejection of Muhammad as a historical figure if they carry them out.
Yeah, I do remember that. I think it was a recent debate with David Wood and Kenny Bulmer, a convert to Islam. And he basically quoted Joshua Little, and David just read a page or something out of the dissertation and said, look, if you're going to quote his work as a Muslim, then you're just throwing all of Islam, like like as you said, you're just throwing out your foundations. And it was really funny. Yeah, it's true.
I'm not sure Joshua Little even recognizes this. He's very invested in defending Islam. I don't have any evidence that he's converted, but he rails against Islamophobia on his website, and he's full of all this nonsense. But I don't know that he's realized what he's done. Really, it's kind of a poison pill.
Yeah, actually, on that topic of Aisha and David Wood as well, one of the, and I know you've had discussions and even had a debate with him on this topic. One of his main points for Muhammad's existence is this, like the Aisha things, like the criterion of embarrassment. So I know you've responded to this, but if you could just lay out for us, how do you exactly, respond to that objection? So there are a number of things that are said about Muhammad that would be very embarrassing. So it would probably make more sense that these things happened and are just embarrassing facts about him than for them to be, kind of made up. So what's your response to that?
Yeah, that was actually the central argument that David used when he and I debated this way back when the first edition of Did Muhammad Exist came out. And it was also the argument he used when he debated Jay Smith about it. And I would expect that if he and I were to talk about it today, that would probably be the cornerstone of his case still. And I understand the power of the argument. It's really the only argument you can make, because there's nothing from the 7th century you can point to. There's nothing that shows that any of this material has any historical value. So the only thing you can really fall back on if you want to say Muhammad was real is that people would not have been crazy enough to make up this stuff. I'm not moved by the way, by the argument that people say, well, he's a coherent personality. You know, a single personality emerges from the Hadith, and so that indicates that he's a real guy. In the first place, Macbeth is a coherent personality, and he's made up. Hamlet's a coherent personality, and he's made up. You can make up coherent personalities, and that's even true if you have a number of people, a number of cooks making the broth, a number of people writing the traditions, because they're working from a certain set of assumptions about what kind of person they're dealing with and depicting in these stories. So I don't think that cuts any ice. But as far as the criterion of embarrassment goes, the argument I made against it in the debate, as well as in both editions of Did Muhammad Exist, and then I'm going to expand upon now in the critical biography, is that what's embarrassing to us is not necessarily embarrassing to them. There was a very different culture, very different time. And so it's not even just that child marriage was taken for granted. As David has very capably pointed out, child marriage was not as taken for granted as the Islamic apologists would like us to believe. But it's not even that. There is generally a reason why these stories were fabricated that has to do with Islamic theology, and not and they don't depend upon the embarrassing aspects. Like, for example, I think the clearest example of this is the Zainab story, not the Aisha story. Zainab, for those who may not know, was another one of Muhammad's wives. She was married to his adopted son, Zayd ibn Haritha, Zayd ibn Muhammad, and then Zayd divorced her and Muhammad married her after he got a vision, got a revelation, that is, that Allah had married him to Zainab. And this is elliptically referred to in chapter 33 of the Quran, which disallows adoption, because that gets Muhammad off the hook. You see that he's not marrying his adopted son's wife or even his ex-wife. He is not his son at all. And so it's okay because there's no adoption, you see. So Islamic tradition fills in the story and tells us that it's all about how Muhammad, he was overcome by her beauty, and Zayd offered to divorce her, and Muhammad said, no, keep your wife and fear Allah. And then Allah tells him, why are you turning away the gifts I want to give you? And marries Zainab to him. So people have pointed to this story throughout history and said, see, this guy's out of control. He marries his daughter-in-law because he's so full of lust he can't control himself. And even his son, his adopted son, knows this. And so he offers to give him this wife. And it looks bad. And the whole adoption thing is just concocted in order to justify this story somehow and put a good face on it by showing that really it's just about how Allah wanted to forbid adoption. And so he brought all this about to forbid adoption. Now, that's all compelling. And that may be that's what it's all about. You have this lustful prophet getting self-serving revelations, and he is justifying his own immoral and aberrant behavior by getting these new revelations, and that's what it's all about. However, it is also possible that there's something very different going on. And this is the thesis of David Powers, the author of a book called Muhammad is Not the Father of Any of Your Men, who I depended upon to write this section in Did Muhammad Exist? you'll notice that chapter 33, verse 40, which comes right at the time that the Zainab story is being referred to. It's not really told in the Quran, it's just referred to. And 33:37 mentions Zayd and speaks about the whole thing, kind of elliptically. And then 33:40 says, Muhammad is not the father of any of your men, rather he is the seal of the prophets. Now, why does the Quran suddenly say that he's the seal of the prophets right in the connection with his being not the father of any of your men? Because there is also Islamic tradition that all the prophets were related. And this carries over into the Shiite idea that the imams, the leader of the community, they have to be a member of Muhammad's household. And they all have to be related to Muhammad in some way, because then they'll have something of his prophetic spirit and infallibility. And so if all the prophets are related, then if Muhammad had a son, natural or adopted, the son would have been a prophet, and Muhammad would not have been the last prophet. So, in order to ensure that they're not going to be blindsided by all these other prophets, that Muhammad is going to be the last prophet, and they're going to build their state around Muhammad and their religion around Muhammad, they make up stories about how all Muhammad's boy children, like Ibrahim, die very young, and he had an adopted son, but he repudiated the adopted son, or Allah made him repudiate the adopted son so that he can marry Zainab. So the whole thing is all about that Muhammad is the last prophet. And the whole story was made up in order to emphasize that there is no prophet after Muhammad. And so the lust, the beautiful woman, the unseemly business with the adopted son, they're not even thinking about it. They don't care about that. That doesn't register for them the way it registers for us. All that they're trying to establish is this man had no sons, and thus he is the final prophet.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you so much. All right, now
embarrassment in general, excuse me, I'm sorry, but just
yeah.
to sum up, I think that every last story that you find embarrassing, there's some explanation like that for.
Okay.
Maybe we don't always know it, but we know enough of them to know that we don't have to fall back on just thinking, oh, nobody would have ever made this up, because they have their reasons.
Okay, so it would be a valid argument if there was something out there that people could find to be like actually embarrassing, but these seem to have explanations to them. Okay, so when it comes to Muhammad, I know that his name is mentioned, what is it, 4 times or so in the Quran. So do you believe that that's a title of someone, or do you believe that that's like the later Muhammad that people were claiming existed, or what's your kind of take on the name on Muhammad as it appears in the Quran, the 4 times or so years?
I do believe that's a title. In the first place, just for comparison's sake, I don't have the totals in my head, but Jesus and Moses are both mentioned dozens of times in the Quran. And so it's kind of curious that the last greatest final prophet, the seal of the prophets, is only mentioned by name 4 times. That's one thing. The other thing is, none of them have anything to do with any biographical information, none of the 4 mentions. And so you don't learn anything about Muhammad in the Quran. It's a funny thing. There was a video that some Pakistanis made some years back in which Robert Spencer, who's this whiskey drinking Christian, becomes a Muslim. And he becomes a Muslim because the Muslims are so nice to him who live across the hall. And at one point when he's convinced, he comes and knocks on their door and he says, I want to learn about your religion and your prophet. And the Muslims say, the best book to learn about our prophet, peace be upon him, is Quran. Well, that's not really true at all. Quran doesn't tell you anything about Muhammad. And Muhammad does mean the praised one, or the one who's being praised, and does refer, therefore, it could refer, therefore, to a title that was given to any number of other people. Now, supporting this is the fact that there are other titles that Muhammad has in the Hadith. One is Kutham. Now, Kutham is the generous one. And there's a tradition in Islamic tradition, this is an Islamic tradition, that Muhammad was originally named Kutham and then was named Muhammad later. Now, if you have two titles, the generous one and the praised one, then that would make sense of the whole thing, that it's kind of like Superman. It's not really a name, it's a title, and it's given to him at a certain point. There's also there are also other traditions that are like this, and let me get them. Here we go. There's a tradition that it appears several times in the Hadith. Here's Bukhari's version. I am Muhammad, and I am Ahmed. I am Al-Mahi, and I am Al-Hashir. That is, Ahmed is also the praised one. Al-Hashir is the collector. Al-Mahi is the obliterator. Ibn Sa'd has a version where he also says Al-Khatim, the last, that is the last prophet, and Al-Aqib, which is also the last prophet. And Muhammad is one of those. So you see, if he's saying, I'm the collector, I'm the obliterator, I'm the last prophet, and I'm Muhammad, then it gives credence to the idea that Muhammad's a title. It's just another one of these names that he has. I'm the collector, I'm the last, I'm the gatherer, I'm the praised one, Muhammad.
Okay. Yes. Yeah, I have heard that as well. That's a really interesting perspective on the name Muhammad in the Quran. So when the Quran talks about well, actually, someone asked this question in the chat. I guess we'll go to this one. It's asking about the companions. Do you believe that the companions existed, or are they the ones who kind of made up Muhammad, or were they made up as well?
I think that the answer to that is a definite maybe, that the companions may have existed, but we do not have any evidence of them, any direct evidence of them. When we read all that business about Abu Bakr and Uthman and Umar and even Ali ibn Abi Talib, this is all very late material. It is not contemporary material. And so it's the same thing. We don't have independent attestation of anybody among the caliphs before Muawiyah, who became the caliph in 661. The rightly guided caliphs, the Khalifa Rashidun, it's probably more legend than fact. But the people who made up Muhammad seem to have come later. Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, who I mentioned before, and Abdul Malik, who was the caliph at the time, at the last part of the 7th century, because it does look as if, the Hadith material bursts out in the early 9th century. It didn't come from nowhere. It wasn't all just written in the early 9th century. It's clear that some of it does go back. I don't think it goes back to Muhammad, but it goes back, and probably to Abdul Malik and Hajjaj and to that time.
Okay, and so for the Quran, when do you date that to in terms of when it probably was compiled, or what would you say that goes back to? How far does that go back to the Quran?
Around the same time.
Around the same time.
Yeah, we have quotes from the Quran on the wall of the Dome of the Rock that was built in 691. Now, the funny thing about the quotes from the Quran on the Dome of the Rock is that they're mixed in with other material that's not the Quran. And some of the quotes from the Quran are not the exact words. And so it seems as if the Quran was being formulated right around the time the Dome of the Rock inscriptions were written. And so the material was not standardized at that point. Otherwise, it's very hard to explain why they would mix in non-Quran with Quran without any kind of differentiation. Unless maybe this wasn't all the Quran yet. And then in around 730, you have John of Damascus, who was a Christian, a saint in the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church, very important Christian theologian of the period. And he writes the first Christian critique of Islam. And he shows a clear awareness of the Quran, except it doesn't seem to be the Quran as we have it today. And let me go to that, because I do have that also in the critical biography. I believe that's going to be chapter 1, but it might be chapter 2. I know I should know. I wrote it. Here we go. Okay. John says that Muhammad composed many frivolous tales, to each of which he assigned a name, like the text of the woman, in which he clearly prescribes the taking of 4 wives and 1,000 concubines, if it is possible. Now, of course, we do have the surah of the woman, or women, actually, which is chapter 4 of the Quran, and it does say you can take 4 wives. It does say you can take sex slaves or concubines, the captives of the right hand. Doesn't say you can take 1,000. So maybe John got that wrong, or maybe the text was different in the version that he saw. And he says Muhammad mentions the text of the table and the text of the cow, and that's of course chapter 5 and chapter 2 of the Quran. And then he says Muhammad's book also contains the text of the camel of God, about which he says that there was a camel from God. Well, there is that story, that weird story that's in the Quran in chapter 7, chapter 11, and chapter 91 about a camel from God. Kind of a strange story, like so many other stories in the Quran. It's not told fully. It's just referred to as if you were all familiar with it. But there's no chapter, the camel of God. Maybe there was in what John saw, or maybe he just got it wrong. We don't know. But it does seem as if the Quran was being formulated by that time. Although there do seem to be indications that it was not in the form that it is now.
Okay. All right. So by the way, just let me know how you are on time. If you're okay, we can keep going.
Yeah, I have to go by the top of the hour, but
all right. So about 20 minutes. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, great. So I am kind of relying on the chat as well. If you guys do have questions, please do feel free to ask. And so when it comes to creating the myth of Muhammad, I guess you might word it like that. What you mentioned how this is probably like to kind of tie an empire together. Do we know exactly who these creators were, or do you think it was just whoever was the generals of the armies, or whoever the leaders were that kind of wanted to just unite everybody by a religion, or do we have any identities on these people who created Muhammad?
Well, yeah. When Abdul Malik has the Dome of the Rock built, I'm sure he was responsible also for the inscriptions. And so the inscription says there's no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet, the statement of Islamic faith. It's noteworthy, however, that right after saying that, then the statement goes on to talk all about Jesus, which suggests that even when it's speaking about Muhammad, it's speaking about Jesus, that Muhammad is a title that is being used of Jesus in that context to deny that he is divine. That Abdul Malik was the caliph and leader of a sect that was monotheistic but rejected the divinity of Christ. So the whole thing is a critique of Christianity. Otherwise, you have to believe, if you believe the standard Islamic story, that the Dome of the Rock inscription starts out by saying Muhammad is a prophet, and then immediately changes the subject and speaks for the rest of the time about Jesus.
Okay. Now that is usually cited as like an evidence of Muhammad's existence, right? Or maybe what you could do is just kind of list some common evidences that people do cite for, like, let's say a Muslim or something like that who would cite for Muhammad's existence. I know they mentioned some coins or something like that. What are like the top three? And then maybe you can kind of give your general response to why those actually don't prove what they're set out to do.
Well, I mentioned before the Doctrina Jacobi, which is from the 630s and is a mention of a prophet. It says here, when the Candidatus, which is a member of the Roman Imperial Guard, was killed by the Saracens, I was at Caesarea, and I set off by boat to Sycamina. People were saying the Candidatus has been killed, and we Jews were overjoyed. And they were saying that the prophet had appeared, coming with the Saracens, and that he was proclaiming the advent of the Anointed One, the Christ who was to come. I, having arrived at Sycamina, stopped by a certain old man well versed in scriptures, and I said to him, "What can you tell me about the prophet who has appeared with the Saracens?" He replied, groaning deeply, "He is false, for the prophets do not come armed with a sword." Now, that's a very early mention of an Arab prophet, although the word Arab is not used. Muhammad is not mentioned. And the prophet appears to be with the Arab armies that are coming out of Arabia, supposedly after Muhammad's death. I mean, the official story is that they came after Muhammad's death, but the Doctrina Jacobi seems to say that he's with them as they come, and that this prophet is preaching the advent of the Christ. Now, Islam does say Jesus is going to come back at the end of the world, but that's hardly the core message of Islam. So it doesn't seem as if this really corresponds to Muhammad. Excuse me. That's one. Then we have another one. This is a note that was actually written in a copy of the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. And some guy wrote in the margins. In January, dates from around the late 630s. In January, the people of Homs took the word for their lives, and many villages were ravaged by the killing of the Arabs of Muhammad. So many people point to that and say, look, the Arabs of Muhammad, they're killing. This is the Arab invaders. Sure. But here again, we do not have any kind of indication of any of that voluminous material in the Hadith, or any of the stories that we take for granted as being part of Muhammad's message now. Then after that, we have a reference to, by Thomas the Presbyter, Christian priest, a battle between the Romans and the Tayyeye de Muhammad in 634. And this is where Hoyland says the Arabs of Muhammad, but the Thomas the Presbyter actually says Tayyeye, and Muhammad may have been this guy, but he may not. It's just a bare mention. Seems to be a warrior prophet. This is the primary picture we get from the 7th century, that there was a warrior prophet named Muhammad. Although actually many of the accounts that mention Muhammad either say he was a prophet or say he was a warrior, but don't put the two together. And then later on, you start to get the warrior prophet. But we still are very, very far away from all that material. Now, you got to think about what would be necessary if the traditions about Muhammad were really historical. That would mean that all these people had them memorized in the 7th century and all through the 8th and into the 9th when they were written down. And they were passed on flawlessly through all these different chains of narrators, you know, all the isnad chains and all that, all of it flawlessly. And so that would mean that all the Muslims, or many of the Muslims anyway, in the 7th century, they had a lot of this in their heads. Why didn't they ever quote Muhammad? Why don't they ever refer to Muhammad? Why don't they ever tell people we have this new prophet, this new holy book, this new religion? They don't say a word. Why not? Where, you know, you have in the gospel, I mean, not in the gospels, in the Acts of the Apostles, in Acts 20:35, Paul is quoted saying that Jesus said, "It is more blessed to give than to receive." It is more blessed to give than to receive is not in any of the four Gospels. It was an oral tradition that Paul had heard, and he's passing on because he has it in his mind and it's relevant to what he's saying. So why don't we ever see that with Muhammad? That nobody in the 7th century, if this warrior prophet is the same guy that we're reading about in the Hadith, nobody in the 7th century ever says, well, you know, our prophet Muhammad says this. There's nothing.
Wow. Okay, that's interesting. Someone was asking this question. They said, do you think that Muawiyah was a Christian of some sort? Have you?
I don't
have
think
you
so, because he. Let me see if I can get to that here.
Okay.
Yeah, that I have some of that in this book. This book will not be out for a long time, so I probably shouldn't be talking about it so much. But pardon me. He does go to when he, according to a chronicle from the year 661, he goes to Jerusalem and he went and prays at Golgotha, and goes to Gethsemane and prays at the tomb of Mary. Now that's very odd. You know, why didn't he pray at the mosque if there were mosques? Why didn't he pray at some Islamic site if there were Islamic sites? He goes to these Christian sites. And so he may have been. But there's something else that I can't find right now, but I do believe it exists, where he's warning Christians that they should drop their idea that Jesus is divine. And so it may be that he was some kind of heretical Christian, some kind of Ebionite type that rejected the divinity of Christ, something like that. He doesn't seem to have been an Orthodox Christian, but he certainly doesn't seem to have been a Muslim. He did also mint coins that say Muhammad, but they have crosses on them. Now, if Muhammad had said Jesus is going to come back and break the cross, why are they minting coins that say Muhammad and have a cross on them? It makes no sense whatsoever, unless Jesus is going to break the cross is actually something that was made up much later, almost 200 years later, and put into the mouth of Muhammad. And Muawiyah had no idea that he said something like that, or even that there was such a person.
Okay, so I guess I'm not seeing any other questions there in the chat that are kind of, well, there are some questions, but something related to Muhammad existing or not. This question was asked earlier. It's not really related to whether or not Muhammad existed, but it was the question was whether or not Arabs are descendants of Ishmael or not. I'm not sure if you have any thoughts or you care to comment on that at all.
Well, they certainly say they are. I don't know.
Okay.
This has never been something that I've.
Not interesting. Yeah. All right. Yeah. So I guess we can kind of wrap up with that then. Are any other final thoughts? I know you've mentioned your book a lot, and you got us all really excited for it. So if you want to comment anything else on it, or kind of give concluding thoughts.
I have to apologize because, like I say, it's not even at Amazon yet. It's not going to be out for another year or more. I have a deadline of December 1st, but all things being equal, and if society doesn't completely break down by then Muhammad, A Critical Biography, will be out sometime around this time in 2024. So I hope you'll remember this day. Also, I have a book coming out in November of 2023, one that's all finished, called Empire of God, How the Byzantines Saved Civilization. And that's a history of the Byzantine Empire that is a little bit, of course, Islam has a lot to do with it, but that's not primarily the focus.
Okay, that's one we'll look out for. Okay, so that's in November. All right, great. Well, we thank you so much for your time, and I'm sure that we'll see you again on the channel sometime on another topic. Thanks so much for joining us, and hope everybody appreciated it and enjoyed the stream today. Thanks, everybody. God bless you all. We'll end out now. Thanks, Robert.
Thank you.
Okay.